cannot remove a single part or the entire object, purpose, function of whatever unit it is, it stops. A car would not be an example of an irreducibly complex machine. You could take off the doors, the hood, the windshield wipers. You could take off many, many, many things that could still accomplish the purpose of rolling down the street. My car is an example of that. But irreducible complexity is one of the primary arguments in favor of God and of creation as compared to what they term macroevolution, which means evolution between a species. Everybody in my generation, and even before that, and of course after that, have been raised with this whole concept of evolution as law. That you have slight mutations from one generation to the next, and eventually you'll get from a bird to a reptile. Things will eventually happen over the course of millions and millions of years. But the problem with that whole line of thinking is this whole concept of irreducibly complex functions. And it's one of the things that has always been encouraging to me in my own personal development and my belief in God, because there are things throughout creation where this happens. From sodium crossing a cell membrane. Sodium itself, and I apologize to any doctors in the whole audience for all this stuff. Sodium itself can't just cross a cell membrane. If it could, we'd all die because you'd have imbalances all over the place and we'd all die. It actually gets into a separate little vehicle, crosses the membrane, and unloads itself. And so they're able to maintain balance in sodium levels between inside and outside of a cell. In the cilia, which are those little wavy arm things on the side of like single-cell bacteria, the complexity of a single cilia, little hair thing, is so massively complex. There's multiple systems going into play to make those things work. If the cilia didn't move, if the sodium in the same generation, if all those aspects of that machine, of the function of transferring sodium across, didn't evolve in one generation from the dad who wasn't able to do it for some reason, and suddenly the kid that was able to do it, you simply cannot exist without this entire function happening. Blood clotting. Everybody, I'm assuming, has skinned a knee, cut themselves, seen blood come out of their body in some way, shape, or form, whether they want it to or not. Blood clotting is one of the most awesome, irreducibly complex functions in the world. And scientifically speaking, it's just insane, but just to simplify the process, you have what's called fibrogen, I think it is, fibrogen, little things floating around your blood plasma, harmlessly just floating along, having a great old day, and then something gets cut, and your pressurized system in your body starts pouring out that fluid known as blood. There's another chemical, another protein, thrombin, that actually has to cut this fibrogen and turn it into fibrin to create like a sticky substance. A part of the proteins are cut that then it'll mesh with another cut fibrogen, and eventually they'll start meshing with other fibrins at this time to create a web which will catch blood vessels or blood cells trying to escape. But the thing is, you can't just have thrombin running around randomly cutting things, or else your body would be clotting continuously all throughout your body. So you have to have another thing that activates the thrombin to cut the fibrogen to start the mending. And if it was that easy, that'd be simple. But you have to have something that actually activates the activator, which activates the thrombin, there's like 6 different steps, and like 2 to 3 different steps that have to occur at each different step before your blood can even clot. Then there's a whole series of steps. Here, let me show you. This is actually the layout. Actually, no. This is a mutation, back to evolution. This is the beginning of the mutation to a tiger that the bunny's going through. But anyway. This is blood clotting. And if this makes any sense to you, you have the wound, then you have the hegamen. It goes all the way through to even what's called a Christmas factor. Isn't that nice? To a Stewart factor, all the way down until it makes the clot. Then it has to stop clotting at some point. Because if you get a cut and it keeps clotting beyond that cut, suddenly your entire body congeals and you die. So this entire system exists of the multiple steps to stop the clotting of your blood. Involving, and you can't even follow it. I tried. I've read through stuff, I don't know how many dozens of times, and I look at this again and I go, oh. So don't get discouraged if it makes no sense to you. It's so complex, and yet every single step in this is an irreducible part of the process. If a single part of this wasn't there, you'd either never clot or you wouldn't stop clotting. People with hemophilia or constant suffering with blood clots, which can kill you, there's a couple different forms of hemophilia, and it just involves one step in the process. And these people are lifelong at risk. And that's just one minor step where there's a slight problem in one of these steps. It's amazing to me. But this entire system would have to evolve in a single generation, which a single part of this would be a huge leap of thinking about evolving, let alone this entire system in one generation. So, and this is just one example, and I have a book that lists hundreds of examples of these irreducibly complex systems, which are just overwhelming because you realize there would have to be some kind of a creator to do this. Now, what does this have to do with Father's Day at all? Good question. But I firmly believe, and I would contend, that the family is another one of those irreducibly complex systems that God has put in place. That it's not something that's just evolved over the course of millennia to, oh, now a dad's useful, oh, now a mom's useful, that it actually existed from the beginning. And that only when this family is functioning the way God has created it to function do things work out the way they should work out. And when people try to mess with this plan that God has in Scripture for the role of the father, the role of the mother, the role of the conduct for the children, the way the parents should treat their children, the way the children should treat the parents. When this entire plan, people try to upset by saying, you know what, that's not necessary because I know better. Unintended consequences begin to happen. And it affects more than just us. Because our nation is made up of societies, individual societies around the place. And a society is made up of communities. And each community is made up of families. If our families are broken, that inevitably will lead to a broken community. And if anybody has ever heard Tony Evans speak, he does this awesome rendition from a broken man all the way to a broken nation. And it is extremely true that when you have a family that's broken, it'll lead eventually to a broken nation because all the nation is made up of is broken families. And so if everybody watched the news recently, or at all, our nation is fairly broken, which can only mean that the families that comprise this nation are really suffering, which can only mean they're not doing things the way God made the family unit to function. Now, the difficulty with saying anything is broken is that you risk hurting somebody's feelings. Somebody gets offended because you say, what is happening in this situation is not the way God intended it. But the problem that you run into when people are so concerned with saying something is broken means you never reach out to be fixed. And we serve a God who loves us enough that he's willing to say, what you're doing is hurting you. What you're doing doesn't work. What you're doing is not part of my plan. And so I think that's, it's cool. God sees his original plan, his original function for the unit being deviated from, and he sees the consequences that result from that. Men are, and you focus on men being Father's Day, too often they step away from their own responsibilities.